brought me into imagery with well-known stories and had me thinking about them in ways that I'd never thought about before. You brought insight. That was number one. But two, you and we talked about this in the pre-show walkthrough. You put a reader's guide right in near the end, and I've never had this before. I've never encountered this before. And I told you in the pre-show walkthrough, who does that? I mean, who puts this is how you're to read my book. First time through, you read it. Second time through, look up the scriptures. Third time through, look up the footnotes. And I thought, what in the world? So I started reading it. And as I got into it, then I started to understand. Your footnotes are endnotes are the most robust, detailed endnotes I've ever seen, in that you can grasp the gist of the story, but you get a full flavor, a weighty flavor when you digest that. What made you write the book in that way?
It was actually part of the negotiations with Crossway, as against with other people, that they'd allow me to do that with the endnotes. There are some short footnotes that are just clarifying things that are in the immediate text. But the idea was that I wanted to give people the basic storyline. In the first book of personal suffering, in the second book of what I call the full Christian story, I wanted to give people the basic storyline, and one which any Christian, and not even just Christians, but anyone could follow if they were just willing to read it. But then what I wanted was the endnotes to enrich the basic storyline in such a way that people would realize that, wow, there's a lot more for me to think about here that fills in the picture, that makes the Christian revelation the marvelous thing that it is. If I had put that in the text, it would have distracted from getting the basic storyline across. Carl Trueman mentioned in one of the interviews that he had with me, he's done 2 interviews on mortification of spin with Todd. He mentioned that the first book is only 99 pages long as far as the basic text, and that's intentional. I want people to be able to get through that stuff. What I tell my students, I told them just yesterday because classes started up again, is that they are not going to understand any of the texts that we're dealing with unless they read them at least 4 times. The first time you kind of read through with nothing in your hand, you don't want to be marking the text up. You just read through more or less almost skimming, so that your mind is starting to get a kind of sense of the terminology and so on of a given piece of text, usually a chapter at a time or something like that. The second time through, what you're trying to do is isolate the basic structure. So for instance, with C.S. Lewis, with The Problem of Pain, the first chapter, which is only 15 pages long, has 3 primary pieces to it. And so I told my students yesterday, I need you to find those pieces. I want you to tell me where the second one starts and where the third one starts. And what you do is you read it through and you're constantly asking, what's the author doing now? 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 The third time you go back through and you're a little more careful to make sure that you've got it right. And then I want people to write a single sentence that captures what's going on in each of these major parts. At that point, people are pulling out their hair. They're all seeing pens and their Talbot Cupid doll. I tell them that's fine. Go ahead. I can take the pain. You go ahead and torture me by sticking pins in the doll. They need to walk away at that point from reading the text. They need to have a few hours. They come back, they read the text again on what they have, and they try to decide whether or not it's right or wrong. And the other thing that I tell them is that they're going to have to reread these texts every day before class. That they are not going to be able to understand the depth of a really worthwhile book, because a really worthwhile book is like playing against your better in some athletic sport, such as if you want to become good at tennis, the way you become good at tennis is you get somebody who's better than you are, who you're playing against, who can place shots that you have a really hard time getting. I used to snow ski a lot, and I skied with 2 experts. And doggone it, it meant that they, at the top of the hill, would say, see you at the bottom, Mark. And I learned to ski really, really quickly. Maybe not much form, but I sure did learn to ski really, really quickly in just trying to keep up with them. reading's the same way. We tend to think in America that reading is a passive activity, that you just kind of pass your eye over the page, you get the information. No, with deep books, what you're after is understanding, and understanding can only be gotten by wrestling with the text and by being able to stop and think about what you're reading and maybe turn back a few pages and read something that you know relates to what you're dealing with now on a page a little further on. As I say to my students, you just cannot get, you and I would, I think, both agree with this, you can't get everything you need to be a deep Christian by means of listening, by means of podcasts. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason is because they kind of go on in real time. And so you say something or I say something, and the podcast goes on with a book, with a codex. In other words, the sort of thing that we have, you can move back and forth between pages, and you can stop and pause and think about something. The codex only became significantly important after the Christian faith started to become important in the ancient world. And of course, Augustine ultimately would have attributed the consolidation of his will so that he became a Christian who would give himself fully to God by means of his having a codex, a book, in other words, of Paul's writings. He's in a garden. He just cannot turn his will fully to God. He goes to the edge of the garden and hears a little kid over the wall saying, tola lega, tola lega, tola lega, take and read, take and read, take and read. He thinks, I don't know any game like this, but he takes that to be a word from God. He goes back, he opens up his codex, he opens up his book, and it falls on words that say, not in rioting, not in drunkenness, not in this or that. This is the way that one must follow the Lord. Remarkable passage. And so, in fact, he took that as to be directly to him a word of God, and one where he says he put his finger or something in the page in order to remember exactly where that was. Once again, that's what books do for people.